All right, thank you. Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you to TOCT, the Old Chapel Trust, for inviting me to speak. And thank you all for coming to listen to me. I've just left this on for the time being. These are the 6 key points of the People's Charter, which was presented to Parliament around the time of the martyrs and the time that my book is set. I'll talk a little bit more about the historical context later on, but I just left that on for the time being so you could refresh those 5 points, which were not, people couldn't take any of this for granted until much later. Of course, all of them now, apart from the annual Parliament, have been long established. But in the 1830s and 40s, that was just a wish list. Right, as Philip just mentioned, I am a retired teacher. I've been writing fiction for about 10 years or so, and I'm very much an amateur historian, but I obviously know a little bit about this period. So the basis for my talk this evening is this book, Blessed Are the Meek. It's my 4th novel. It's the first one that is historical. I published it in 2019, but it does tie in with this place. At least I will try to show that it does tie in with this place as in my talk. So normally, if I talk about my books, I'm talking about plot and characterization and language and structure and so on. But tonight, I'm going to deal primarily with the historical background to the story. So I'll highlight the book's major historical elements, read a few extracts to illustrate my points, and then I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have at the end, providing they're not too difficult. I am an amateur historian, remember. So, here we are in Tolpuddle, in a building that was put up in 1818, where working men and women and their families, agricultural labourers in the main, would meet and worship according to their Methodist traditions. So it may seem quite a leap from this place to the lives of mill workers in the growing urban sprawl around Manchester. But in many ways, the conditions and limitations of their lives were not so very different. In the factories, just as in the fields, life in the early part of the 19th century was harsh. Poverty and deprivation were rife, and opportunities to improve one's life were very rare. At the heart of every hope a working family might have, it seems to me, be there in the northwest of England or the southwest, were 3 strands, 3 pillars: education, religious faith, and solidarity. And it was solidarity that would provide the labouring class with their chance to challenge the establishment, in particular by agitating for a change to the economic and parliamentary stasis, essentially by demanding the right to vote in elections. That was the key thing. And these demands were the driving force of a political movement, the seeds of which had already been sown by the time this building was erected. And certainly 1 year later, in 1819, its voice was given full expression at an enormous rally of working people at St. Peter's Field in Manchester. A little more of which later. By 1838, the Chartists were well organised, a substantial force across the country, ready to put petitions to Parliament with their charter of 6 demands, which gave them their name. And we know that one person who was active in the movement, not long returned from Australia, was a certain George Lovelace, formerly of this parish. Now, the next slide comes with a warning. I know some people in the south of England, if they consider anything further north than Oxford, gets the cold sweats. I'm not saying anybody in this room applies to, but I'm going to show you a map now of a mystical land known as Lancashire. If you can see that, it's not great, I'm sorry, but this is as best I can do for the time being. So we're talking about the northwest of England. So you've got Liverpool, Preston, Manchester. This actually is an old map from a school atlas, a 1960s map. But here, Hyde, which I can point to in more detail, you can see it there in the middle of the map. That is the town. That is the key town in my book. So, if you know this area, you'll perhaps recognise some of the names. Slightly interesting is that this wiggly line that goes around is the old county line, and Hyde was in Cheshire. That's a really weird bit of Cheshire. So rather than being in Lancashire, where Manchester is, Hyde was always part of Cheshire. So when my main character, James Shore, ends up in prison, he ends up at Chester Jail. So my novel is firmly anchored in the middle years of the 19th century and is set in the northwest of England, specifically the town of Hyde, which began the century as a small semi-rural settlement just 7 miles east of Manchester, which at the time was only a town as well, a small town as well. It sits on the edge of the lower Pennines, and is watered by their streams. It is a town which grew rapidly over the following decades thanks to the mining of coal and primarily as a result of the industrialisation of cotton production, attracting workers from rural parishes across Cheshire and Staffordshire and Derbyshire particularly. Its population grew from just over 800 in 1801 to over 10,000 50 years later. And the attraction to these newcomers was a better wage, but with that came squalor and exploitation. This is a rare picture of Hyde when it's quite fine and good weather. This is the town hall on a nice winter's day, crisp winter's day. And this is a memorial to the Hyde Chartists outside the town hall. So Hyde is the town I grew up in the 1960s. The impetus for this book, however, came during a much more recent family visit up there. My younger daughter was a history A-level student, and she was studying at the time a project on the Chartists, just by chance. Now, I'll bring this into better perspective. I knew that this monument was here, this memorial was here, but I've never really paid very much attention to it. In fact, it was only put up, I think, about the millennium time. But there it is. You have, I don't know if you can read that, it says, "Pull the plug, ring the change," which is a bit like Labour Party's slogan for the election. Plug, this little girl, or the character here, has got a plug in one hand, and the other girl, or the child, whatever, has got a bell. So that was the slogan of the Hyde Chartists, and the pulling of the plug I'll explain later on. But pull the plug, ring the change. Now, I knew that Chartism had taken a hold in Hyde in a substantial way, and I knew this memorial existed, so we went down to look at it. And on the back, at the bottom, on the back of this memorial, there is a plaque, which is probably impossible to read. Oh, it's not too bad. Hyde Chartists, pulling the plug, ringing the change. So on the back of this memorial, I saw this plaque listing the names of 18 local men convicted Hyde Chartists, 1848-49. And I spotted they were in prison for their parts in the riots. On this list, there is a character here. I don't know if you can see that. James Shore, my name. Not that common. And he was a 28-year-old machine maker, so he wasn't just a weaver, he was probably a bit more technically talented. And the thing that interested me as well was the fact he got 2 years hard labour, his part in the riots. Most people are getting 18 months, 12 months. It was the harshest and longest sentence of all. So I was very curious about this character. Why was he given the harshest sentence? Who was he? What was he doing involved in the Plug Riots? What happened afterwards? Am I related to him? All of these questions. So I was quite determined to find out a little bit more about him. And once the research had begun to bear fruit, I decided I would like to write a story based on his life. So I'd already written 3 novels, but they weren't historical ones, but I felt confident enough to try to pull a story together and fictionalise his life. So I was helped enormously by members of the Tameside Local Studies Group who pointed me in the direction of census records, ancestral records, registers of births, marriages and deaths, newspaper reports, old maps, various other relevant texts. They were incredibly helpful. And so the staging post of James' life, which became clear to me, that became the structure of the novel, to which I added characterisation, conversation, dialogue, dramatic incidents and so on. But I had the structure based on what I found out about him. So my book is a work of fiction, but one based largely on factual evidence and set among real events and in real places. Now then, here are some dates. I've incorporated a few of our local dates as well. For example, the swing riots and the Tolpuddle labourers' arrests and transportation and so on. All of this is happening in a sort of 30, 40-year period from Peterloo, the Petersfield massacre, which I'll talk about, down to really 1848. The key dates from my novel are 1842, which is the first Plug Riots, and then 1848, the second Plug Riots. And those 2 years, as I say, are times when economic downturns, depressing wages, coincided with Parliament's rejection of the second and third petitions. By this stage, the Chartists are getting millions of signatures. I think, nobody knows for sure, but the records that I've read talk about 3 million for the second petition and maybe 4 to 5 million for the third petition. It's a lot of people in that time. And each time, the Parliament is saying we're not interested.
Any idea what population of England was?
No, I said I'm not an amateur historian. I don't know. Somebody will maybe. I don't know. But it seems a lot of people, doesn't it? 4 or 5 million. It's a good chunk of the population who would have signed this. So in those 2 years, anger led to strikes and demonstrations, which in turn led to rioting. And just a note here on the wage levels as a comparison with the figures that were suggested for Dorset. The Dorset agricultural labourers earning around 6 shillings a week at the time of the martyrs. And the average wage of a mill worker in Hyde in 1842 was 10 shillings a week. The owners were threatening to reduce that to 9 and then down to 8. And the third, as I said up there, 1819, that's the third significant date in my story, already mentioned. 1 year before James was born, the year of the massacre at St. Petersfield. 18 people were killed and over 650 injured as local militia brutally dispersed a huge, previously peaceful crowd who'd assembled for a political rally. The event, which became known as Peterloo, cast a shadow over the following decades and served to galvanise the radicals who would later call themselves Chartists. So it's kind of the beginning of it, really. I was keen to include Peterloo in the book, so I set it as a reference point for James as a boy. And I imagine a scene where his father, John, tells him of the day when he and 10,000s of others in August, men, women and children, marched from the surrounding towns into the centre of Manchester, and he tells him about what he saw there. So that's a set piece, earliest chapter in the book. Now, in his 20s, James was impassioned by both a young woman called Anne Lambert and who became his wife, and the ambitions of the local Chartist movement. The meetings of the agitators were usually held in pubs, arranged in secret and not advertised among the supporters until the very same day to keep the authorities in the dark. And there's a description in my book of a meeting James attends in which the litany of issues is addressed, from the reduction of wages, threats of strikes, from the poor state of workers' houses to the crippling price of bread. Not to mention an awareness that the army was mobilising in the area to deter violence. Nevertheless, the riots of July 1842 were imminent. In the May of that year, the Chartist second petition had been put to Parliament and summarily rejected. So, as I mentioned, this is a time when the political and economic crises were converging. So I'll just read a little bit of that period. So it's after the meeting. And so it was that James fell into lively conversation with a new group of fellows who shared the general mood of anger and frustration. It had not struck him until then that the sentiments were not restricted to cotton workers. Other industries in the area were equally affected by the slump, the rise in prices and the decline in earnings. Shop workers, hatters, iron forgers, bleachers and printers and coal miners. If the evening crystallised anything for James, it was the growing awareness that the wrath of these men and women was running in two channels, like a river divided by a finger of land. The principal demands, at least from James's viewpoint, seemed to be strictly industrial: better pay, better conditions in the workplace, union representation, and so on. In parallel to this, he reasoned, was the thrust of the Chartists, that real reform would only come with a radical change in political representation, meaning a revolt against the established order. New parliamentary constituencies, the opportunity for a man without property to stand as a member, voting rights for every male adult in the land. It was a keg of gunpowder, James knew, one that had not yet been lit, but incendiary nonetheless, and one whose day, he believed, would come. And as long as these two streams flowed towards convergence, he felt enthused to paddle in this direction himself. And here's an extract detailing the men's tactics during what became known as the Plug Riots. So an explanation of why they call the Plug Riots. So he's discussing this with some friends. What's the point of breaking up machinery, William Greenhalgh was wont to ask, when sooner or later you'll be wanting to go back to work in the very same mill? It's like your Luddites all over again, said Joseph Slater more than once. Remember how well that ended. James could see through Joseph's sarcasm, but conceded he had a point, as indeed did the Chartist leaders. To destroy machinery would only lead to unemployment and further hardship for the strikers in the run of things. Across the parts of the country where Chartism had flourished, the plan was to disable machines rather than destroy them. As most machinery was steam-driven, the most effective method was to cripple the boiler by removing the plug on the blowdown valve. James was familiar with this operation. He had watched his father perform it many times. It had often been John Shore's first job of the day, drawing the plug on the valve at the lowest point on the boiler to drain sediment and scale which may have settled overnight. James knew that the seal between each cock and gunmetal plug was unique in precise size and shape, and that the more often the plug was forced into the body of the valve to maintain a seal, the more troublesome it would be to replace. Grinding a new plug to fit an old valve was a difficult task, one that could disrupt a boiler for weeks. And this was the Chartist thinking, which James understood. By removing and stealing this small but crucial element from a boiler, their actions, rather than destructive, were obstructive. Their objective was to temporarily stop work rather than to destroy machinery. Pulling the plug involved little danger and caused no long-term damage. it was a clever ploy. So James gets involved in the 1842 riots, not with great success. It's in the book, obviously, it's the story of that. It's a slightly clumsy contribution. His contribution in 1848 is much more significant, much more dramatic. But I'm going to leave that there for people who want to read the book themselves. There's plenty to be... So, in addition to the political, by necessity, I touch on many areas of social history in the book as well. I wanted to portray James' life as a son, a husband and a father, to show his experience as a factory worker, as a man with friends and enemies, hopes and disappointments, to show him more than simply an agitator and a convict. Similarly, I wanted to shine a light on the lives of those close to him, mainly women, as it happens, notably his wife, Anne, his mother, Mally, and his sister, Jane. Now, Jane is an artist, and her skill at pencil drawing is her route out to a higher level of society. Anne, his wife, is loyal to James up to a point. She's an acquisitive woman, is impatient for a better life, and becomes irritated by her husband's involvement in politics. Meanwhile, Mally, his mother, is a survivor through good times and bad, James's greatest champion and the heart and soul of the family. Mally died at the age of 79, which is phenomenal, really. It's very unusual to live that long, I think, in those days. But she's an interesting character. She's a very strong character through the story. James started working as a piecer in a spinning room at the age of 10. When he was 13, his father died of typhoid, and the family was plunged into poverty. I mean, these are facts. Some of the story obviously is made up, but that's definitely a fact. So this is a little section where he's with his mother talking about how life will change on the death of his father. One evening, she sat James down in front of the flickering hearth and explained how things would have to change. Whatever happens to this family, Jamie, I don't want you to worry. It's not your responsibility, it's mine. I'm your mother. I'm not yet an old, decrepit old woman, and it's my job to look after you all. You mustn't fret. What's going to happen, Ma? The boy asked. Will we have to leave home? No, not that. We'll find money for the rent to stay here. James sighed with relief. He'd lived all his life in this cottage, and for all its draughts and creaks and curious smells, he loved it. But we'll have to eat less, Mally went on. Meat on a Sunday, and only on a Sunday. Less bread. You know how dear bread is. We can't afford what we had when your father was alive, dear God rest his soul. I'll learn how to make oat cakes, and I'll still be buying taters now and then. One way or another, the Lord will provide. The Lord may or may not provide, but at least James knew that Mally was a most resourceful woman. For years, she'd wheeled her rickety handcart down from Hyde Fold laden with milk and eggs and occasionally a rabbit. There was no reason why she could not continue to do so as long as she kept on good terms with Mr. Harrison. And now she would find other things to fill it with. James had seen her collecting fallen branches in the woods, which she sawed up for kindling. She would do more of that. She knew where wild strawberries grew, the glades where mushrooms would appear, where windfall apples lay in the autumn. She also had plans to sell herbs. Whenever there was a sickness in the family, she knew where to go to find medicinal leaves and roots, be it borage or angelica, coltsfoot or elderflower or yarrow. She would collect larger amounts and sell them door to door. If she angered the apothecary in the village, then so be it. She would ask their neighbours if she could take in their washing. To those that had a bit of garden, she would offer to dig it for them. Whatever she had to do, She swore she would keep the wolf from her door. Right, a loom. At the peak of the local cotton industry in the 1850s, there were over 20 mills in Hyde. Today, there are none. I remember a school trip in the early 1970s to one of the last to close, a poetically named mill called Throstle Bank. I think it was the very last one to go. We went round with a teacher who was enamoured of local history. And I can still remember the noise of that. This is the 1970s. The noise, a sour smell, dust in the air. For my more recent research on this, I visited Quarry Bank Mill. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. It's a place near Manchester Airport. It's a restored mill. This is a picture taken from that. It's about, I think it's a National Trust property now. So Quarry Bank Mill, this is part of an old room, I guess. They've got these mills, these looms together. There's about half a dozen of them there, but in the mills, when they were running properly, you're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens of these things together. So let me give you a flavour of the inside of a cotton mill in the mid-19th century. James's wife, Anne, was more cut out for pub work, but she did spend a brief part of her working life in the weaving shed at Apethorn Mill, which I describe here. James's wife, Anne, a woman who had previously eschewed mill work, felt obliged to contribute to her new family's income by, temporarily to her mind, following her husband and brother-in-law Richard down the lane to the weaving shed. I say shed, it was an enormous room. She quickly learned how to do the job, and with even greater speed, she learned to hate it. She became accustomed to the heat and the sudden drafts. She managed to ignore the acrid smells of machine oil, the mustiness of cotton fibres and human sweat. She even coped with the dust catching in her throat with every other breath. But the most horrifying aspect of the mill was the relentless, thunderous noise of the machinery. From the constant whirring of the drive belts and the grinding of cogs to the violent clattering of the shuttles being flung angrily back and forth by the picking arms, the din in the cavernous room was unforgiving. Even if a dozen looms were stilled for a moment's pause, several dozen more were still active a few paces away. Some women, like Anne, tied headscarves tight to their ears. Some didn't bother, having grown immune to the torture. Some had gone deaf years ago. Communication, frowned upon by the overseers, was made by a combination of mime and exaggerated voiceless expressions of the mouth. The weavers called it memoing, and Anne picked up the art as quickly as she learned how to operate the loom. On occasion, it was a necessary means of averting an accident or indicating a malfunction, but more often than not, it had become the workers' way of engaging in idle conversation. Lip-reading a ribald remark might be the only moment of amusement in a gruelling day. Now and again, she might catch sight of her husband in the shed, but as a rule, James was given jobs to do in the spinning rooms. Occupying several hundred hands, the weaving and spinning were conducted in two separate buildings, both immense structures of brick, as large as cathedrals, he imagined. Each 4 stories in height, lined with row upon row of outsized windows. At the end of each edifice, rising from a squat boiler house, stood a chimney which belched coal smoke hundreds of feet out of the valley and higher into the heavens. Toiling in the huge, humid spinning rooms was equally uncomfortable, as James would testify. Here, most of the piecers and young scavengers worked, very often more of a hindrance than a help, he thought. Over the frenetic shunting and racking and the twisting spindles of the mules, over the agitation of men and women and scurrying children, again, the dominant impact on the senses was that of the pitiless rattle of the machinery. He preferred to work with the scutchers and the combers and the rovers in the carding room, where the ponderous machines cleaned and teased out the raw cotton, feeding it onto the rollers of the drawing frames. Here, the noise was less ferocious, but this was the dustiest place in the mill, and he would find himself repairing machines operated by hands with sore eyes and wheezy breath. Everyone knew that the specks of dust dancing in the sun rays were far from harmless. While I was writing the first draft of this book, one of the discoveries I made was that James's conviction in 1848 was not his first. I learned that he was also jailed in 1842, following the first Plug Riots, for harbouring stolen goods. So I had to rewrite part of the plot. It was very good because some of these people back in Hyde who were helping me, some of the people at the local history centre, kept emailing me with more and more information as I was writing this story. And I mean, it was very helpful, but I basically had to rewrite whole sections of the story. But a lady called Stephanie, I don't know, something, I can't remember her name. It's in the back because she's such a great person. What's her name? Stephanie Shakeshaft. Good name. Stephanie Shakeshaft. She kept emailing me every so often. I found some more information, Brent. I found some more. And it's great, but it did mean rewriting things. Anyway, I thought he'd just been jailed in 1848, but it turned out he was jailed in 1842 as well. That could be one of the reasons why he was given a longer sentence. In fact, it probably was. The way let me explain what I made of that. I do describe several examples of petty crime in the story, but this incident of him being jailed for harbouring stolen goods gave me further scope to highlight the arbitrary, almost random nature of the English justice system at the time. Something that Mike Leigh did very effectively in a series of early short scenes in his film Peterloo, which you may have seen. Effectively, James takes the blame for a theft committed by his youngest brother. So he didn't really he wasn't really guilty of it, but he takes the blame because his younger brother's only 12 or something at the time. Anyway, here he is at the moment of his arrest, the first arrest. So at this point, he's on crutches as well. He was kicked by a horse during the first Plug Riots. James Shore was arrested later that day as the sun set behind the distant horizon of Werneth Low. 3 constables searched the cottage, insisting he struggled to the outhouse to explain the gin and the brandy and the silver carriage clock. George, that's his brother, petrified by their presence and impotent to hide the loot anywhere else at short notice, stayed upstairs and prayed that the men would have no questions for him. Jane comforted her mother. Richard helped his brother back into the scullery. James Shore, declared an officer, we have witnesses who saw you being carried away from the scene of the looting on the night of the riots. Do you deny that those cases of spirits are part of the stock that was ransacked at Crofts Brewery? James looked back at his mother, who shuddered. He was struck by the absurdity of his situation. As an associate of a looter, or branded as a thief himself, he was set to be made an example of for the very crime he despised. He looked up at the constable, shook his head, and was promptly taken away into the custody of the county court. Mally was wrong in her estimation of the punishment, but as James was to discover again and again, the dispensation of English justice was as arbitrary as the weather. From a striking cotton worker caught up in a riot, to a Chartist activist addressing a meeting, from a thief to an arsonist to a fool who admits harbouring stolen goods, nobody could be sure how the system of punishment would be interpreted. A warning, a fine, or a jail sentence, it was like being dealt a card from a pack in a gambling house. And the sentences, months, years, even transportation, again, a roll of the die, the whim of the judge. Nevertheless, even the most pessimistic spectator in the trial court convened in Hyde was appalled on the day in October when James Shore was sentenced to gasps of disbelief to a full 12 months incarceration in the county jail at Chester Castle. So that was his first imprisonment. A few years later, shortly before the second Plug Riots, James's mother warns him to keep on the right side of the law. At this stage, James is going to lots of meetings, lots of political meetings in the town. I wish you'd not go to those meetings, James. I worry that you're mixing with a troublesome crowd, and you've been drinking. This fine remark of Anne's was of some irony, as she herself had been serving ale all evening long, and this in spite of being 7 months pregnant. I bought myself 1 glass of beer, said James. Thomas was good enough to stand me for a second. I've told him often enough myself, chunted Mally, sitting by the hearth, warming her bones. You've already served a term in Chester jail, son. You get into more bother, running around with a lot of rebels, and well, who knows? I shudder to think of you shut up again. Or worse. What could be worse than prison, said Anne. They put him on a ship and leave him on the other side of the world. It's called transportation, Mother. It's not going to happen to me or anyone else just talking in a meeting at the Institute about politics and the price of a loaf. I know what it's called, James. There's no need to be shouting at me. I heard about them labourers in Dorsetshire. I wrote this in 2019, before this place is open. I heard about them labourers in Dorsetshire, them that were sent to Australia for misbehaving. They were pardoned, every one of them, insisted James. They came back. They'd formed a union, that's all. It's not even illegal. And I'm not even in a union myself. Keep out of it, James, said Anne, yawning. Let's go to bed, I'm tired. Aye, let's. You're fretting over now, you two. I'll not do out daft, and we've got right on our side. It's God on your side you need, snapped Mally. God's got naught to do with it. If you don't want to be poor all your life, it's up to you to do something about it, I'd say. Blessed are the poor, the woman intoned. It was one of her favourite verses, oftentimes on her lips. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven, she asserted, as though it were an irrefutable fact. Another aspect of social history I indicate in the book is the arrival onto the English industrial scene of workers from Ireland and the animosity that this could cause. Now, unlike certain other characters, James has got no axe to grind with the Irishman in the story, an invented character who becomes a friend and, to some extent, an inspiration. More of him later. I wrote the novel from the point of view of a narrator, a fictitious narrator named Walter Rowbottom, a school teacher who befriends James later in his life. And careful to avoid any modern idioms, I tried to construct the book to be read as a book written in 1881. So I'm kind of channeling Hardy Dickens if I try to write a book in that type, in that period, in that style. So it was written 2 years after he dies. So Walter Rowbottom has time to think about how he's got friendly with this man and he's learnt all about his life. So he's written this book, not me. Walter Rowbottom is the narrator. Now, in Rowbottom, who was employed by the church, I've combined 2 further elements of 19th century history, so the roles of education and religion. There's a sharp and deliberate contrast between Walter and James, two characters who nevertheless share much mutual respect. We can guess from his marriage certificate, signed with a cross, that James, at least in his early 20s, was illiterate. In this case, he was typical of his class. As he grows older, he appreciates that reading is, as he says, the way forward for the working man. His frustration with his lack of education is echoed by his sensitivity to music, which he's barely able to express. His Irish friend, O'Brien, gives him a tin whistle, which he tries to learn to play, but with little success. He's acutely aware that his life is no more fulfilling than his father's was. Now, Rowbottom is a counterpoint to this. He's an educated man, he's a musician of moderate talent, and he's an optimist. And towards the end of the book, he lists the achievements of the age. So he's writing this in the late 1870s, 1880s, so by then things have moved on a little bit. He talks about the slow but steady progress made by the Reform Acts. So it was beginning, more and more people were getting to vote by this stage, towards the end of the story. The opening of free schools, advances in medicine, pride in the town and the philanthropy of many local worthies, brighter prospects for the next generation. So the book does end in a more positive manner. Just throw this one in. I visit these themes and other aspects of social history in my second historical novel, 26 Nil. This is set in the 1880s, and as it has at its heart civic pride. By this time, Hyde is a thriving town and quite wealthy, actually, relatively wealthy. They have a town hall, it becomes a borough. They have a football club, etc. They have a library, swimming baths, public baths, etc. So that book is maybe a subject of a different talk, but that's how this book sort of leads into that one a little bit. Blessed Are the Meek, meanwhile, has a title that is in some ways misleading, as the book is it's not a religious tract. Some people have picked it up when I've been selling these and says, "Oh, is this a story of is it the Beatitudes, and it's all about the religion and the New Testament and so on." So no, it's not a religious tract. The meek here are the powerless, the exploited, the voiceless poor, the mill worker in the north of England, the agricultural labourer in places like Tolpuddle. Nevertheless, it is a considered title in that religion was a much more significant part of life in the 19th century than it is today. We only need to look around us this evening, sitting in a place built as a matter of urgency for religious purposes. Now, James and Walter have different views on religion as well. The teacher is employed by the Unitarians of Hyde Chapel, a church frequented by James's mother, who sings half-remembered hymns to herself throughout the book. It was interesting to note that the relative importance of churches like Hyde Chapel in the area, and we have a contrast here with much of the south of England. And Tolpuddle is a good example where the established church, in this case St John's, has existed for hundreds of years, well before this chapel was built. On the other hand, nonconformist and Methodist chapels predominated in industrial towns, as in the previous century their message had been taken out by followers of John Wesley, specifically to the labouring classes, whom organised religion had tended to ignore. And Hyde was typical of the chain of mill towns around Manchester. Aside from Hyde Chapel, which had existed since the early 1700s, several other Methodist chapels had been established in the town many years before the first Anglican church. The first Anglican church in Hyde was built in 1832, St George's. Before that, there were several other Methodist chapels already established. So it may be hard to imagine George Lovelace working in a cotton mill in the northwest of England, but from a spiritual angle, I think he would have felt very much at home in Hyde. And elements of the Methodist hymnal appear throughout the novel, and one such features in my final extract. I was thinking as I chose these readings that the impression would be one of relentless gloom, confirmation of all the "it's grim up north" cliches. But don't think that, please. It's of course, times were hard, but this book does have lighter moments. It has moments of joy, moments of warmth, and there's even moments of comedy. There's a bit of humour in it as well. But I tended to have chosen the more dour extracts. Anyway, the last one comes from an episode. Comes during an episode in James's life when he's struggling to re-establish himself after his second imprisonment. So, 1852. It is actually. This would be. He's about 32 at this stage. And it ends with another dramatic element of the 19th century experience. Not to be confused with forced transportation, rather the appeal of a planned escape to a new continent. Indeed, as we know, once the 6 Tolpuddle martyrs returned to England, before very long, 5 of them had chosen to take their families to new lives in Canada. So I touch on that in this extract as well. So this is towards the end of the story, a little bit. 197. So he's a bit fed up. He's had two jail sentences. He's lost his wife, and he's having trouble finding work, etc., etc. James made the best of his time through the months that followed, but at heart he was unfulfilled. He saw his brothers' lives through envious eyes. He had not seen his sister since before the riots. She had made her home with the musician in Stockport. Mally told him that her husband had forbidden her from seeing him, a twice convicted man, whether he was her brother or not. In rain or shine, the pleasures of tramping over Werneth Low remained a consolation. He would oftentimes head up into G Cross with its familiar shops and houses, which he saw less of these days. In a movement reflecting his sequence of addresses, his life had slipped down into a dark valley. He liked to walk past the old Flashbrook mill, now standing empty, and up to Higham Fold, where Mally had milked cows for Mr. Harrison. Beyond that point, he would march onward to the higher rim of the hill, and, if the wind was not so sharp, would find a spot to sit at, fill his lungs with the fresh air, and digest the views. There before him lay the faraway spread of Manchester, with its tiny towers and chimneys beneath the soft haze of smoke. He recalled what people had told him of that place, its squalor and its stench and its danger. He had never seen it for himself and never wanted to. Closer in his prospect was the urban pattern of the chain of towns with their familiar mills and smokestacks and church spires and tight lines of narrow rooftops. Hyde, the nearest, then Dukinfield, Ashton, Stalybridge, a distant inlay of Oldham. He watched the birds darting and swooping above his head and the puffy clouds gathering at the horizon. He looked for movement in the tufts of grass for rabbits. He would stay until he began to feel hungry. Sometimes he took his penny whistle with him, and in the quiet of a cleft in the hillside, he would try to tease a half-forgotten tune out of it. He might spend a whole hour repeating a short series of notes that pleased him, even in their slow monotony. If he tried to accelerate the music, the clarity of tone would falter, or he would get no further than a dozen notes before his fingers failed him, and he would stop and sigh. Or if frustration finally overcame him, he would beat his head with his fist and fling the little instrument into the long grass. On some days he retraced his steps. On others he descended Joel Lane, passing the pub and the hat works. One evening in September, with a golden tinge to the leaves and a musty dampness in the air, he decided to cross the fields by back at Thill Farm and follow the course of Gerrard's Brook. He padded down by a line of hawthorn. Would he live forever with these views, that even in his jail cell he could conjure up with his eyes closed? Were these fields, these trees, these rooftops, the physical limits of his passage towards death? He could hear Mally's voice singing off-key, mangling the words of a favourite hymn. From Greenland's icy mountains, from India's coral strand, where Afric's sunny fountains roll down their golden sand. Would he ever see sights like those? Would he ever feel the spicy breezes blow soft o'er Ceylon's isle? About halfway down, he caught sight of a figure resting on a stile. As he approached, he recognised Isaac Slater, who was contemplating the horizon, holding a pipe to his mouth. The two men stood chatting for a moment before Isaac agreed to accompany the other on the downhill path. You remember the games we played up here, Jamie? He asked, when we were young'uns. They were crossing the stream by way of a fallen tree trunk. Is that all we get? Isaac said once they reached the other side. All we get? All the happiness we get, a childhood of games and freedom. Are all the best days of your life supposed to be contained in a man's first 10 years? It can't be right. You sound very melancholy tonight, Isaac. That's a good word, and a true one. We'd both hoped that by now our lives would be better. False hopes. False hopes, Jamie. I had a marriage I ruined. I hate my work. I do the same now as I did near 20 years ago. And now it's likely to change. I'm 33 next. James said nothing. He did not wish to put his own disappointment into words. Even Edward Howarth has a better life than I do. Eddie Howarth, can you believe it? He coughed abruptly to clear his throat and spat the phlegm into the grass. And he doesn't have a lung full of dust like you and me. He even got himself engaged. She's as plain as a donkey, mind. Eddie bloody Howarth living like a prince. I'd no idea. Living down in the dip, you lose track of folk. I've been thinking of leaving this place, said Isaac presently, turning his head to gauge his friend's reaction. Try me luck somewhere different. What'll you do? Isaac offered no more than a grunt. Where'll you go? I don't know. I don't know for sure. Happen you could get a job on the canals. I've thought about that myself. See a new horizon every morning you wake up. It's not so much here I want to leave. It's England itself. I've been thinking about this country, Jamie. For a working man, for the likes of you and me, now it has changed since Peterloo. The strikes, the protests, the sound and fury, all that's come and gone. Now it's really changed. They sacked the charter. Unions have got no money. The members have now to spare for contributions. The same folk have kept all the power, all the wealth. Their privilege. Privilege? Inherited privilege. Unearned. Passed on like a family heirloom. It's a word my father used a lot. Well, he were right. But look, he's long dead, and here you are, a generation later, and your life's no better than his were. If change is coming to England, I'm telling you, it's coming bloody slow. They had reached Jollybank Row at the bottom of the Gerrards. This is where we must part, said James, cupping the other man's shoulder. America, said Isaac abruptly. America? Aye, that's the place. A new country with a different kind of society. Across an ocean, you'll need a fortune for a passage. Not as much as you might think. The land of opportunity, so they say. So they do say, you're right. I've got a bit saved up, Jamie. Since the wife scarpered, I drink a lot less of the beer these days, he laughed. Well, good luck to you, Isaac. Come with me, Jamie, he said with sudden urgency. We should sail together, you and me. America, eh? We could make a living out there, a proper life, find ourselves wives, make our fortunes. James smiled at the thought, then discarded it. Good night, Isaac, he said. Look after yourself. Think about it, said the other, before turning away. A ship to America. It'll not cost as much as you might think. Leave this place behind us. There's nought for us here no more. And the next chapter is called The Leaving of Liverpool. Right, I think that's as far as I go with that, but Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I'll...
Well, thanks very much, Brent. And there is time for questions. I always think that actually, the historical novelist does things that many other historians can't. That is to imagine the great, massive changes in history, how they affect people at an individual level, how they actually affect people from the inside out. And I think you did a great job there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Some questions, please.
Gary.
What was the economic rationale of the employers for reducing their wages?
Why do the employer to keep so they have more money themselves? The profit margin, isn't it, I suppose?
But they must have been aware that. Okay.
I mean, they take. I think they take it as far as they can, won't they? They would try. They would. Can we get away with this? Can we get away with this? Reduce it a bit more. They're still working for us. Fine. Reduce a bit more. They may make a fuss, but we can. They get away with what they can, I suppose. Because I suppose the price of cotton, for example, coming from America, would be rising as well. They've got their own overheads and their own prices to consider.
About Anne Lambert supply.
Yeah.
Is that historically accurate?
Yes. Yes.
Really?
Yes. The
taboo divorce of that kind of thing at that time.
Well, she appears on the, which census would it be? The 1841 census. She appears with him, living with him. The 1851 census, he's living with his mother, and she's no longer there. So, I mean, I don't know what happened exactly. I'm guessing. Pardon? She was alive, yeah, but she was living somewhere else. I think she was living in Ashton or some other town. So, for whatever reason, she'd left him with the children. So I just have to kind of make up a story around that. I don't know what she did and so on. But one minute she's there, the next minute she's not. So he ends up without a wife.
Question about Richard.
Richard.
Have you got a Jamie Shore back in your...
Same question. No, we're not related. We're not related, although I feel I am. I really do. I think the Shore side of the family that I was part of, my granddad and so on, is more Stockport based as opposed to Hyde. So, I mean, they probably are related, way back. But no, he's not a relation of mine. Interestingly, I met, when I was doing one of these talks up there, the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Richard Shore, who was the brother, was in the audience, and which was great fun. So afterwards she came and spoke to me and said, I'm related to... And she was absolutely delighted that I'd written this story. You've got to be careful, though, because if they're real people... I mean, I could have interpreted James Shore as an idiot or an evil person and I had to just play safe and make him fairly neutral. I've got no idea what he was like, really, in terms of his character. But when you're dealing with real people, you might end up meeting their relatives, which I did. But she was really made up that I'd written this story. And another one of the 18 men imprisoned, Armitage. Amos Armitage, I met one of his relations as well up there, and so she bought about half a dozen books for the whole family. It was really nice. But no, he's no relation, Richard. I'm afraid. Well, I'm not. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. But
are you allowed to adopt an ancestor?
Pardon?
Are you allowed to adopt an ancestor?
Well, I probably have already. Really. No, that's the thing about writing historical novels. If you've got half of your characters are real people, you've got to be very careful. Really have. So all the kind of nasty or foolish or crazy people in the story are the fictitious characters. So half of the characters are real in here. All his family, mill owners. About half the people in here, but the other half are just made up. There's a couple of nasty men in this, a couple of nasty characters which are made up.
Sorry, there's a question for you.
Did you actually compare the wages of the mill workers in Hyde and with perhaps something comparable in London?
No. I just found out what it was, and I didn't. I mean,
What was the actual going wage for?
well, it said in the I think what did it quote you? 1850s, wasn't it? I think I got a figure for 1850s. It was about 10 shillings a week. So it's more. Obviously, people move from the country. The poor, the people, the labourers, palm labourers, could do better by getting a job in the factories, better paid work, but they're living in terrible accommodation.
Except it isn't better because we know the 1830s here, the expected agricultural wage was 10 bob, except in Tolpuddle it was 9, reduced to 8 and 6.
Yeah, well, it was, yes.
Here, specifically because of costs, I think. So the farmers were squeezed, 10 farmers were squeezed. The landowners, some landowners did support raising the wage, as they did, for example, with Hampshire at the same time. They were, you're right, the average wage was about 10 shillings. The conditions were much worse. So I think there's a combination of things. There's a squeeze on the tenant farmers, which is a certain, it's really what we're talking about, a certain obstinacy about actually raising the wage and cutting returns.
Maybe also in the mills it was guaranteed work, 12 months of the year, steady, as opposed to working in the winter in the fire,
Well,
So,
the agricultural revolution was pushing people off from farms as well. Fewer people.
I think that was the problem with the threshing machines here, was that threshing was one hell of a job. It was giving a stick and bang sorts of corn to get the grain off, but it paid less, but it was what got your family through the winter. So when they brought in the threshing machines and the work was done in 2 weeks and whatever, and that was it, you didn't get a payment the following month. And so you really had nothing to live on, is my understanding of it.
Lorraine?
Yeah. The agricultural workers in Dorset, they had tied cottages built for agricultural workers, because there is this in London or its surrounding areas, because it was much more rural anyway. Then the agricultural wage of a worker was 10 shillings. But did they have tied cottages in London and Oxford? There's lots of rural areas, like Florida.
I would imagine so. Yeah.
So there were lots of remote places that required farming. But would they have had tied cottages like?
I'm guessing yes. I would think so. Where else would they live?
Well, there's some around here, isn't there?
Yeah.
Mostly estate-related. They're mostly estate-related properties.
Mm.
And over the last 10 years, you've seen the disappearance of the red doors and the blue doors in Plug Riots, which was the Drax estate. They've now sold out properties that used to be tied with the local area. They always had a coloured door, which was either red or blue, depends. I believe the Drax estate was blue.
And the Kingston Lace was red.
The Lacey was red. The dairy that belonged to Kingston Lace would have been that dark maroon red.
Yes.
But they were since been sold because it's obviously good money now to sell back properties and not have the responsibilities of the workforce.
Well, all the houses that were built, if they're still there, they're built for the mill workers. They're all privately owned now, obviously, because there's no mills anyway. But a lot of them would be knocked down because they were so poor, particularly in the city, in Manchester. I mean, these towns, it's all part of Greater Manchester now, but there were specific individual towns, and there were fields between them, They weren't all one massive urban sprawl, and people would have to walk miles to get to the next town. I mean, I'm saying in this story that James, who lived literally 7 miles from Manchester, at that point in the book had never been. That wouldn't be a surprise. To go into Manchester why go? You've got shops where you live. Plus, it's expensive if you want to hire a horse and cart or whatever. So people just wouldn't travel, really. Tony?
Yes, Brent, thank you very much for
Sorry, you didn't hear some of it.
Well, I was outside.
Oh, you're outside,
I'm
right?
so sorry.
Okay,
I was inconveniencing you.
it's all right.
God, I don't know what they did about colds in 1830, but anyway, what I want to know was, the average age of your hero, he died at 59.
He did, yeah, well spotted. He did.
Was that the average age of death for a cosmo, or did he actually lived?
I think he did live longer. Yeah, I think he did live longer. 59.
So cutting wages and two spells in prison, they did no harm at all.
Well, he died in a workhouse. He died very, very well. I'm spoiling the story now. His death is very sad. The end of his life is really, really sad. Pardon?
That's historical. He died in work.
Yeah. So, but he did die 59, which is not a bad age at all. But I was saying his mother. I don't know if you heard that. His mother died at the age of 79, which is phenomenal. I mean, they say it's urban life, but where Hyde is on the edge of the hills, there were farms and small little sort of cottage mills as well, and there was fresh air compared to Manchester. There was fresh air, there were fields, there were farms. So I think she had a fairly healthy in that respect, and she lived till 79, which is brilliant.
Do you feel that your story, good as absolutely true, doesn't it show how successful the ruling class in Britain have been just slightly ameliorating the condition of the workers, letting them have a little
bit more, yes.
A little bit more, a tiny bit more, little hope. Some could go to America, but those who stayed have had a job, and they survived. You know, the Duke of Devonshire, 23,000 acres now or something. I mean, not much changes, except we do have a pension.
Well, then you have a vote as well now.
Oh, yes.
Nothing much changes. You're going back to a comfortable
you have it. Yeah.
central heating and a bottle of wine before you go to bed.
But this business about slowly. I mean, I've got in the back of the book, I've got an appendix where it talks about how the voting changes and how the franchise gradually gets bigger, but it's inch by inch by inch. Obviously the end of the First World War, then there was major franchisement for men anyway, but that's 1918. Peterloo was 1819, so 99 years after Peterloo, finally, most men in England had the vote. But women didn't. And, yeah.
Can I just say, on sort of that point, I really like that last passage you read, because there's a sense of I'm bashing my head against the brick wall all the time. I mean, Chartism failed. There were unions. What happened to the Grand National Consolidation? That failed, didn't it? That failed.
Yeah.
The plug plots didn't really.
No, massively.
And yet, I think sometimes we look back and we think, all this progress towards the vote and trade unions, it sort of seems inevitable. Isn't that the way sometimes? Is that the way secondary history teachers might suggest? And it wasn't, was it? And your last passage there just captures that. The chap's bashed his head again.
Yeah, I mean, things did, as I said at the end, though, by the 1880s, things had got a little better. I mean, there was more money, for example, in Hyde, so people could spend more money on public things. But I think they gradually, more and more enlightened politicians decided that these people had the right to, they got a point here. We can't carry on not allowing them forever to. Pardon? Continued agitation. Yeah, absolutely. Slow progress. Absolutely.
It's generations.
Yeah.
Minimum wage now. There's always a fight and a squabble about it from certain quarters of society, owners, typically, businesses. I want to pay minimum wage. It's going to destroy jobs.
Going to destroy jobs. Now it's 16. What is it on? £16 now.
I mean, it seems glacial, but there is no time in history I would rather live in, and there's no country I'd rather live in, and I'm actually about the place to live in Britain at the moment.
Well, Just
Heather.
It's when you'd like to watch it's going to
Can I just say something? There's progress in the books. Like, there's a second one, 26 now. Those people there, those people in that football team, have got time to play football.
Yes, yeah.
To spend Saturday.
Yeah, Saturday afternoon.
Were those chaps playing for Manchester United?
That picture is actually the Preston North End team, not the Hyde team. I couldn't find a picture of the Hyde team. There didn't seem to be one. But this is a famous match that Hyde played in the FA Cup against Preston, and the score was 26-0. And so that's also based on. Yes, they did. But that's a picture of and the reason I like that picture is because they're not in football kit. They're in suits because it's not just about football. That story. It's about social history as well and pride in your town. And I think that covers good.
Yeah, so we've got young men with time on their hands and can afford a nice suit.
Yeah, so things have moved.
They look as if they had a bath this week.
For the photograph. So 1887, this photograph. And then this one is 1913, just before the war kicks off. And that's the Manchester Ship Canal. So this is all about trade and prosperity and the threat to that by war. Opening of horizons from, this is all horse-drawn carriages and candles. Here we've got motor cars and telephones, and tanks and machine guns. So that's a yes.
I took this picture at the museum last year when I was looking at the background to the play that we did that play. And I've read something similar when I was looking at researching daughters previously, but this is talk about average family expenditure. Rent of a shilling, this is the 1840s, rent 9 shillings.
Really?
That's a total of 13 shillings. So the
bread. Yeah.
Yeah, bread is expensive. A lot of families could afford it. Many families didn't have means. One of the things I wanted to mention was I thought a really interesting thing you drew out when you were talking about James taking you round.
Yeah.
The sentence for having stolen goods, because this is families did manage crime in that way. I was talking to Carol Ann Savage, who's a member of the History Department, who's done a lot of work on daughters to prison, and the most tragic, terrible stories about how, for example, if a father had committed a crime, the worst thing for the family would be that he would be no money. So in some cases there is evidence that they had to sacrifice
somebody else said I did it. Yeah.
Better for the child to go. Shorter sentence. Man still bringing in the money.
Yeah.
Just think how desperate, how kind of dreadful that must be. In I know we must talk about this book. In Emma Griffin's fantastic book called Breadwinner, which she wrote on the back of reading 700 working class biographies. Emma Griffin. I think she's president of the Royal Historical Association. Not Historical Society. But in that book, she writes quite a lot about what happens when the breadwinner is imprisoned or runs off. Because like somebody else was talking about that, how people, not divorced, but people scarred wives and husbands, and how once that crime structure was fractured, how desperately difficult it was for women left with children. So, managing crime by, in some way, passing in silence within the family. It's very common, but it wasn't unknown. And it does make you think just how desperate people are. And there is of course, a parallel with the Tolpuddle martyrs. We don't go into that with one taking the rap for the garden. But we won't take that one out. But I thought that was a really sort of
In my book, I had the James, because he was having been kicked by a horse so he actually can't work anyway for that time. So he's not earning anything. So his mother says, "Well, you're not earning anything for the time being. You can go to prison for a few months." But in fact, he's 12 months. That was the thinking.
Were they? But they're in jail. It's in the double blow.
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just as a passing thought, would you have actually been better off in the Iron Age, when up in the hills you could dig yourself a massive pit, fill it up with grain, which apparently would keep for 2 years, and we had so much grain we were actually exporting it to France. So instead of spending 9 bob out your 13 shillings per week,
I don't
you're not paying any rent because you can build your own mud hut. You've got.
I don't think you'd live till you were 59 in those days, though.
Oh, might live longer.
It's all in the name of progression, but on reflection, how do we progress anywhere? The things where we have improved is not so much child poverty, child death, and not so many children. On the news recently that people are only having maybe 1, if possible, 2 children. But I think through the education and through advice on more children or less children in this case, and all being rather grateful to what we've got. And history keeps us founded with our feet firmly on the ground. And that is meant to be progression. Machinery, threshing machines, all one and the same. It just changes, it evolves within and takes different angles, in my opinion.
Today I took my 90-year-old stepfather to have his coding exam, which I'm told if you go and buy it privately, it's 99 quid. So at the moment, the state thinks that 90-year-old is worth 99 quid. Well, I mean,
yeah.
I got my note.
We've got one more. It's not that question about that. Is it George Lovelace, who's the, was he one of the Tolpuddle?
Yes, sorry. When I said that, I assumed everybody knew that, because most people have been to all of these talks, and yeah, George Lovelace was the main man of the Masters. Really.
Was he one of the ones who went to Canada?
He ended up in Canada. Yes, he did. Yes, yeah. But he was a Chartist. He came back and was part of the Chartist movements in the.
Transported to Australia. 2 years, came back.
3 years. 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
they didn't find out that
Yeah.
that had to be looking around. Oh, that's about me. Oh,
But it struck me when I mentioned about him fitting in Hyde because of all the Methodist chapels there. You know, the Methodist faith was the predominant one up there in the industrial north, where he was kind of hired out of this place because of that.
Well, George Lovelace, of course, the answer to one of the questions earlier on, was convinced there would be progression, because he believed very seriously that the march of mind, as it was called in the 19th century, in other words, the progress of education, would spread literacy. And once you spread literacy, you can explain to people how the economic system works. And as Lovelace always said, profoundly, but simply, the working man is the producer. The producer of wealth, where the people who grew the food and made products of the stuff. These days we hear in political discourse, it's usually put the other way around. But Lovelace was convinced that things need to get better because people would become more educated. And that's been very, very clear in his writings. He was a great believer in the significance of education and literacy. Because it brought reason, analysis, understanding, and enlightenment. Wasn't the only one who thought that in his period at all, but it's a very important part of his beliefs.
and then people know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing.
Donald Trump,
Right, once we're on to Donald.
Yeah, that's enough. We're not going to go there. We're not going to go there.